There was a list of vocab in the reading packet. Most of it shows up on that first page. It seemed kind of clear to me because it's all in cartoon stuff. Anybody want to ask me about those? Fine. There's a couple of articles that I wanted to talk about. It may help if you have the reader with you. This one. Study goal 41 is a really big deal. Not so much for environmental science. Honestly, like, the environmental science part of this is maybe. But like the social, geopolitical, international future implications of this, I think are a really big deal. This is one of those times where, like, I'll throw it in the reader because it doesn't really fit in the class, but I just kind of want all of you to know about this, just as like member of society talking to another. Stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, you often end up, because you've lowered death rates, you end up with a bunch of extra young people, like this. And those young people are really important to stability in a country. It's called a youth bulge. And that's like a demographic term. When you have extra young people, 15 to 20, 20 to 25, something like that. And it turns out that all those extra young people, if you're lucky, that can be extremely useful for your economy. Like if you pull a Singapore saw a bunch of people coming into the high school system. They're like, whoa, these guys are going to be looking for a university soon. So Singapore went on this international hiring spree for college professors. And they built new universities. So they like went to like PhD programs at Harvard, and they're like, hey, you know, if you'd like a full tenure track job, guaranteed pay scale, we'll give you a house to live in, we'll give you a brand new department, you can make your own curriculum, come on over to Singapore. So when all those high school kids got to senior year, Singapore was like, right this way, you have a free paid university education. You can sit right in the front, there's plenty of desks. And there's like a whole generation of people in Singapore, their youth bulge became their largest university class, became their largest group of postgraduate degrees. Now Singapore's this like super cranking economy. Singapore saw it coming. But what happens if you don't see it coming, or if you don't plan for that? Imagine if all of you heard from your friends that they couldn't get into college because there wasn't enough seats for them. So they all went to Blenders to try to apply for like a minimum wage job, and the Blenders guy was like, sorry homie, we already got 37 applications today, you should just keep that. What happens if a bunch of young people, extra young people, can't fit into the educational system, they can't fit into the economic system? Chances are they get kind of restless, they get kind of pissed. And they're kind of easy pickings for terror. Even if not terror, let's not get ahead of ourselves. They're at least guaranteed to be socially unrestful. Imagine if like some terrorist tried to recruit me. Be like, oh, that's a good beard. You want to be a terrorist?
On the 4 blocks that are on the bottom of the board, which ones are useful? 2 or 3?
Usually it's right around here, like sometime after that. Because like, infant mortality means you have a lot of birth rate, but that doesn't mean you have a lot of people 17 or 18 or whatever, right? And then when you solve that die off of the babies, then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, look at all these 10-year-olds. Like, what are all these 15? Like, you keep waiting as they like work their way through the snake, so to speak. And by the time that those people reach like the 15, 20, 25 bracket, you either incorporate them into your society, or what are they gonna do? Like, I'll never be a terrorist. I'm 42, like I'm lazy, I don't really wanna do anything. Like, I got kids, I got a retirement, I got a job. If somebody's like, Jose, you could be a great terrorist, I'm like, yeah, but I'll pass.
Or take the Tacoma to the desert.
Yeah, I just like, I don't know, man. I don't see it coming. I'm not fertile ground for social unrest. Like, if you promised me a bunch of money and I had to work for it, I'd be like, nah. If you like try to get me to complain about somebody else, I'd be like, nah, I'm good, you know, like. If you like blame somebody for all my problems, I'm like, it's okay. I'm old. It's too late for me. But if a bunch of you were getting kicked out of the house by mom and dad, and you couldn't see a future with education, and you couldn't see a future with a career, and you couldn't see a future that incorporates you in society somehow, then the only future left for you is outside of society. You might be bitter, you might be frustrated, you might be angry. Add a little bit of hunger to that, and you've got a perfect soldier. So in many parts of the world, where you see this, and there aren't plans to incorporate those people in society, you end up with problems. And I'll point out that America's greatest period of social unrest in recent times is when the baby boomers got out of high school. Do the math. Anybody know when the baby boom was?
50s.
Yeah, like the peak of the baby boom was 51 or so.
Ended in 64.
That's right. It went from 1945 to 1964. It was a 20-year period. The epicenter of birth rate was 1951. How old were you when you got out of high school?
18.
So 1951 plus 18 is
During the Vietnam War.
1969. And I don't know if you know what was happening in 1969, but the streets of America had kind of a lot of upheaval, instability. All the old people were like losing their brains because dudes were growing their hair out and women were burning their bras. Ooh. There was like free drugs everywhere. Everybody was angry about something. People wanted civil rights. Point is, like, you had the most political participation, the greatest amount of protest. We got a whole bunch of environmental legislation passed under a Republican president who hated environmentalists. Like, the American public was like, because like they couldn't get a job and they couldn't get in college, and they're like getting kicked out of the house, and they were all like flipping society on its head. Coincidentally, there was domestic terrorism, the Manson murders in 1969, by young people who were the baby boomers just out of high school. I'm telling you, like it's this pattern. Right now, some of the biggest baby booms in Latin America are countries with the greatest political unrest, like Venezuela. But Venezuela has like a stereotypical baby boom right now. If you look at history, like the rise of Al-Qaeda was when Pakistan's youth bulge happened.
So what was the difference between Singapore and the rest of those places?
When Pakistan's baby boom was getting through secondary education, Pakistan got into this like bickering match, arms race with one of its neighbors, and into like a religious standoff, civil, sort of like a religious divide across borders with another of its neighbors. So their economy was not paying attention to all these kids. And so they were like, oh my god, nukes versus India, and like squabbling with Afghanistan about who gets to be in charge of what. And so they were just like dealing with social issues when all those kids came of age, and you could recruit precisely some of them to do this and some of them to do that.
But like in America, it was a developed country. Like what about Singapore made it so successful?
Yeah, so Singapore just saw it coming and they invested in this and they made a big deal out of it. You know, like if you can get all of those young people incorporated in your society, that's building a workforce, right on. And if you don't incorporate them in society, someone is going to take them into the fold. They're going to just be out on the streets and they're going to be pissed and like, they're going to do crazy stuff, like Woodstock.
Great stuff.
Crazy stuff. Keep your eyes open. This is a place where demographics will have a big part in your future. It's interesting to see what's going to happen in Indonesia and in India in your next couple of years because of youth bulges. Number 42, I got a cool map from Matt Reale. See this one? If you grow the size of countries based on their rates of AIDS infection, Africa is not a country, it's a continent. So some countries in Africa are worse than others, and so the shape of Africa is a little bit perverted. But especially in the countries that have the highest incidence of AIDS, they have swelled the most. It's crazy to look at the world if you reshaped it based on infection rates. By the way, Brazil looks a little bit swollen. Thailand and Vietnam look very swollen. Australia looks tiny because they don't really have AIDS in Australia, go figure.
Where's Australia?
It's that little bit.
Cambodia.
You can see parts of Africa look about the same, like Madagascar. It looks roughly the same as it would have otherwise. But then you look at like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and that's not how they normally look. Okay, number 43. I'm sorry to tell you bad news. The College Board asked a bunch of trivia. I'm sorry, I don't know what trivia they're going to ask you. There's a lot of trivia in our content. Like in AP Physics B or whatever, they tell the teachers like these 7 skills are what the test is. And so those teachers can just be like, work on these 7 skills and understand them really well, and maybe you can pass the AP test. But for me, they're like, 10% of the test is pollution. That's all I'm saying, pollution. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like pollution? What do you mean pollution? I'm like, shh. So who knows? Maybe they'll ask you about PFAs or PCBs or dioxins or phthalates. I don't know.
That's how you pronounce that one?
Yeah, phthalates. You just skip the pH. So I would recommend 3 things from this page. It's very useful. You don't have to memorize every word. 3 things to look at. Number 1, the names of the chemicals. Number 2, where they're found in your home. Number 3, how they affect humans. I'm sorry, I don't know what they're going to ask you. I try to load up my class with trivia. Just try to raise the odds. Every unit I've got some names or some places, some species, or some chemicals. This unit is chemicals. What? Naomi Ellis and some other computer nerds were going to do some Kahootie type of stuff. They built like a website that had quizzable cards or something. Talk to her.
The website was called.
I think she got over it.
Literally just.
I don't Kahoot nothing.
Music fucking slaps.
Yeah.
Do you need to know, like, for like its location, do you need to know like if it's in like a bottle or just like in the kitchen in general? Because it says like very specific like.
I don't know what you need to know. I don't know. Pollution. Yes. 10% of the test.
What's the other 90%?
I could give you. You can get it yourself. You're already in the AP Classroom. Do you remember when you signed up for AP Classroom? Like log in, like the first page is what's on the test. About number 44, again, there's a little part of this that's in the test, and then a little part of this that I think is just cool to talk about. And I'm trying something new this year. Bear with me. This is clunky for me. I'm not sure I'm doing this right. Bear with me. I'm trying something new. Let's see if this works. Try something new. I got actuarial data.
No idea. That's scary.
I got actuarial data from a person that runs a giant analytical data set for insurance companies. You understand the words I just used? Like, what are the risk of harm based on certain things? Because what happens is, if Soul is like an actor for something fancy, don't look at my secret messages. I don't know why this is on there. I don't know what just happened. I was doing research for a friend.
From the fish market. That could have gone unsaid.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that it could have been. Okay. If Soul is like a big actor in like a Marvel blockbuster, and he's like, pay me $200 million.
Short man.
And they're like, great, yeah, we need Short Man, the Adventures of Short Man. And they're going to spend like $200 million on his contract. They got to know, like, well, we need an insurance policy, because what if he, like, if we pay him $200 million and he gets hit by a car, like, we got to get our money back and not just lose all of this on a movie that we couldn't make. And so they pay a little insurance company. And insurance companies have to figure out, like, what are his chances of dying from all these things, and you adjust, like if he's exposed to one or whatever. So there's a lot of ways to use this data. I'm not an expert at this data, but I got this huge report that was like risk in America, and it's like 4 of these big binders, you know. And I made an assignment that I don't give my students anymore, where my students used to survey their fellow Americans. You would go out into your personal life and ask 20 people to guess how dangerous these are on a 1 to 10 scale. So please read all of them. Okay, now that you've read all of them, you can rank them on a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is the greatest risk to overall average Americans. Like, which of these are the most dangerous things in your future as an American, and which of these are the least dangerous things in your future as an American. And by the way, this data is about 10 or 12 years old, and maybe even older, because I got the report 10 or 12 years ago. And this data applies to a human at birth at that time. So actually kind of close to your age. This is sort of appropriate to you. Maybe to your little siblings. Some of these are rated a 1. Like some of these have very little chance of killing your sibling. And some of these are rated a 10. Like if this happens to your child, it's very likely that they could, to your sibling, it's very likely they could die of this.
But is it, if it happens, it's likely they would die, or like a mix of?
So that's what's complicated. The way that they calculate this is not knowing anything about that person. What's the chances they will die of this?
Well, like, when you drown, it's not like...
But like,
Right, so exactly. This is not like what percentage of people who have drowned will drown. It's how likely is it that drowning would be the thing that kills someone who's born in the year that this data was assembled. Okay? And it's not total chances, we're just ranking them on a 1 to 10. So coincidentally, the most likely thing to kill you is none of these.
wait, what?
Yeah. So the most likely thing to kill you is heart disease. Would anybody like to guess which 3 are the 10s? The most dangerous. Yes,
Is severe obesity one of them?
that is. Good job. Yeah.
Driving in an automobile.
That is a shockingly high number. Americans underestimate how high it is, but it's only a 7 out of 10. Yeah. Yeah.
Alcohol use.
Alcohol use, Americans seem to guess this one correctly, is a 6. I'm not dead yet. Yes.
Living with a smoker.
I'm sorry, what?
Living with a smoker.
Americans tend to guess this one correctly. It's also a 6 out of 10. Kind of in the middle of the spectrum. Yes.
Living in poverty.
Correct. And usually this is one that Americans don't see as deadly at all, but that's a 10. One of the most dangerous things that you could do is live in poverty.
Drug abuse?
What?
Drug abuse?
This study was made before the opioid epidemic, but it's only a 6. It may be higher now than opioids. I don't know. Yeah.
Tobacco use.
Tobacco use was the other 10. Anybody want to guess the 3 that are least dangerous? Yeah.
Visual exhaustor.
Correct, that's a 1. And I'll point out that Americans consistently overinflate that danger. Americans tend to underestimate some and overestimate others. So we underestimate the risk of driving in cars, we underestimate the risk of poverty, and we underestimate slightly overweight. Slightly overweight is a 9 out of 10. And we overestimate natural disasters because we see that on TV a lot. Yeah.
Medical x-rays.
Americans seem to know that that's not that bad. It's a 2. Yes.
Drinking tap water.
That is another one of the ones, and you're right, Americans do tend to fear that. Although this was also before Flint, Michigan. Maybe they should.
Toxic waste.
So our exposure to toxic waste is very low, and Americans aren't too afraid. That's a 2, and Americans tend to guess that correctly.
Flying commercial airlines.
Hello?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Sure.
Shot my fire in the middle of the floor.
Basically, it's hardcore shit.
Bro, you wrote in the back every time.
Yeah, and did I die once?
Sorry about that.
You should have made about it though.
Did he die once?
I nearly died once.
My dad.
In manifest.
Fabian.
Need any of that?
Fabian. My dad's
Okay. Anybody want to guess? The last number 1. There's one that I'm really interested in.
Commercial airlines.
Pesticide residue in food.
No.
I was gonna say.
It is airlines.
And apparently
I didn't
that's...
see that.
I was gonna say.
This whole conversation came up because the guy and I were arguing about the pesticides in food, and he made a concession that it's pesticides used for food, not pesticides found in food, which you are likely to die of. Pesticides used in food, you're likely to die of. He and I were arguing about how it happens, and we were looking through the book, and apparently it's very likely if you're exposed to the chemicals directly as a sprayer or a neighbor, but not as eating the food. But friggin' Mariali yelled it, and he was right. The flying airlines is a 1, but Americans are really afraid of flying.
Well, this was made.
You should be way more afraid of driving.
What about bicycle?
What? You should probably be less afraid of bicycling. Americans are really afraid of their children riding bikes, including my own wife.
Why?
My kids live like 4 intersections from their elementary school. My girl's in middle and junior high now, but my son still, he's like 3 street crossings from his school. And I'm like, dude, please make him ride a bike. He, exercise is good for him, and like, it's safer than being in a car. She's like, no way, man, I'm worried that a car's gonna hit him. And I'm like, yeah, but don't you worry that a car's gonna hit him when you're in a car? He's already traveling like 60 miles an hour. He said, no, I'm driving him to school. And being in a car is way more dangerous, but This is one that really depends on your age. Young people see bike riding as very safe. Old people see bike riding as pretty safe. Unless they've had a child, then they see bike riding as really scary because we're all afraid you're going to hit your little heads because you're a little baby.
Oh, the backup plan.
I still got airtime. I still got airtime.
I'm glad I was able to show you this. I'm glad I was able to show you this because for me, it helps kickstart a separate conversation about risk assessment. We really don't realize what we should be afraid of. So this kind of shows you all American death put into categories. So 1 in 5 deaths in America was heart disease. That's the biggest category. And 1 in 7 was cancer, and 1 in 24 was stroke. What's interesting is heart disease, cancer, and stroke can just be genetic, but are strongly influenced by lifestyle decisions. Like you and I could make changes to avoid most of that heart disease, most of those cancers, and most of those strokes. Instead, what we always talk about is stuff that's way over here. Like, everybody seems to talk a lot about bees or about sharks or about earthquakes. My only reason to give you this is that risk assessment is generally innumerate in America. People don't look at the numbers. And I have a personal story that really illustrates this, and then I'll move on. Your question? Yeah.
Well, I feel like some of these things are like dependent on where you live.
Oh, dude, the correlation versus causation is a spectacular
Like,
separate layer. You know how many of these correlate to poverty? Coincidentally, that also correlates to where you live?
yeah. But I'm saying like air and space accident, like not everyone in America like flies in a plane. And
Or lives close to an airport?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably fair. That's probably fair. And so there's a lot of ways that you can clump these. Correlation and causation is separately interesting. I agree.
But also, isn't it like some of these things come in bulk? Like
You know, a lot of people would die in a hurricane.
earthquake or
Yeah, I could see that. But, you know, bulk relative to the total U.S. population, they probably don't. I'll tell you a quick story. I have had the exact same argument with the exact same people every year at family reunions. Where I love my wife's family. She's got a huge family. We have these amazing reunions. They're like my favorite people. I look forward to it all year. But somehow it comes up with the same old geezers that always like have this intervention with me about climbing.
climbing?
You guys know that I'm a rock climber and I live in Yosemite during the summers because it's a really place to climb rocks. And like every time on the first night usually, when there isn't much to do and everybody's just kind of adjusting to being at the family reunion, they'll kind of like gang up on me and it'll be like all the old generation talking to me. It's like my father-in-law and his 2 brothers and all their wives. And they all corner me. They go, "So Jose, planning to climb this summer?" And I'm like, "Oh, here we go. I knew this was gonna happen. Yeah, I'm definitely planning to climb. You know, I still like to climb a lot. That's why I come here, really. You know, I'm doing this for a long time." And they're like, "Well, you know, we just worry about you." And I'm like, "Yep, I knew this was coming. I understand. Thanks for worrying about me. I worry too." Like, "Because what are we supposed to tell your kids, you know, like if you don't come back?" Kind of dark, bro. I don't know. I'm sure you'll handle that really well because you're like a really good dude and you're really sensitive, and I value that about you. "Are you sure you should be doing this? Because, you know, they're just so young and they really need you around." And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know, man." And somebody would be like, I mean, have you thought about the risk? And I'm like, all right, bro, I'm gonna start flipping tables and stuff. He's like, you're on whiskey number 7, and you just took 14 bong rips like down below the deck over there, and you haven't gotten off your ass in like 40 years. Like, come on.
Are we recording?
Unfortunately. At least I didn't drop any names.
We should get the news out of it at the end of it.
And the truth is that they really love me and they're good people and they love my children. They really are worried about risk. But the reason that I mention this is it's a perfect example of how we spend a lot of time arguing about remote risk and we ignore the tremendous risks of stuff that we all value. Like, we all like fatty foods, so we don't talk about how that's gonna kill us, because that applies to all of us. And it's a lot easier to be like, oh my God, somebody fell off a rock? Climbing's bad, I don't climb, right? You don't climb? Oh, he climbs, so go gang up on him. And like, I really feel that we have a very, very, very clumsy evaluation of risk. Speaking of which, please don't drive, please don't get in a car with a teenage driver. It is definitely the way that most of you will die if you die at this age. It is by far the greatest risk factor in your age group. All other risk factors pale in comparison to a teenager at the wheel.
I'm offended. I've only crashed 3
Shut up, Sadie.
Sadie, you're the worst driver of this class. You try
She was being facetious.
Yeah.
I don't care.
How many times
I got
has
my
sister
driver's
told
license
this
last
story?
Thursday.
Don't use it.
Yay!
Don't use it. Don't use it.
Woo!
How about this?
I do get a free
If there's a dead person in a car accident,
team.
a teen is 8 times more likely to be at the wheel of one of those vehicles than you would guess by their percentage of the drivership overall. You are 8 times more likely to be involved in a mortality accident than somebody a couple years older. Please don't drive.
Not you.
It is the leading cause of death. And if you think about it, we talk to all your parents, and they're like, oh, I'm just so worried about the heavy metal music, or like, I'm just so worried about how many video games. And I'm like, the driving. And they're like, but you know, like Marilyn Manson, and I'm like, the driving. And they're like, have you seen the new Fortnite? And I'm like, the driving.
What's your gamer tag?
I don't have video game.
I mean, Jose,
What?
regarding the climbing, this graph does say that it is the 6th leading
Okay, but
cause of death.
falling is for like old people, right?
Yeah, the majority, the number one type of fall is curbs. Number 2 is bathtubs. Number 3 is stairs in a house. I believe number 4 is ladders outside of a house.
But let's be real, falling.
Good.
Falling.
Yeah.
No, curb dude, like that. Your hood's dope. Like, my hood's got things. All right,
My neighbor's got
I've seen that
back to me.
episode.
No. Stop it. I'm gonna punch Saul if you don't stop talking.
Yeah, Jose, can I do it for you?
No!
Give the thigh.
Here, I can do it. All right.
Number 45, whatever, we already talked about light pollution. Everybody want to talk articles?
No.
Please switch to assignment 5.4. The questions in the movie. 1 through 10. You already saw that movie, I can help you. And then I'm going to tell you 11 through 25 really fast.
Or should we write them down?
Yeah.
I already stapled it. No.
You'll probably want the study guide with you. so that as I tell you 11 through 25, you'll be able to see what questions I'm talking about. So you probably want 11 through 25 and then a paper to put those on.
Which we can ask you about 1 through 10 if we have any questions about it.
What? I got 1 through 5.
So first of all, the reason that I'm doing this is China stuff is a big deal in the environment. Second of all, China fits really well with population stuff, so it falls in this unit. But I've decided to skip that movie so we could talk more about the debates and about other topics in this unit. So rather than make you watch the China movie, I'll just tell you all these study goals. I'm going to go really fast, like 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. As if you were watching the movie fast forward, just the good parts. Number 11, the movie starts by talking about how wealth is a bigger problem than population. You might remember Indira Gandhi saying, one of yours is worse than 17 of mine. The idea being, China's got a ton of people, but when there were a ton of poor people, that wasn't a big environmental problem. But as China has a growing economy, they have growing wealth, and now that's a perfect example of how wealth is a bigger threat than population numbers alone. Number 12, China's a special example of this because they have the greatest population of any country and they just had the most rapid economic growth. In your lifetime, China's economy has mostly flattened off. We're way too late to complain about China's economy. But from the mid-1980s until the early 2000s, like 85 to 2005 or whatever, their economy doubled in 20 years. That's extremely fast. With that many people, that's a huge change. So for number 12, China's a perfect example of extremely rapid growth and an extremely big population. Really visible. Number 13, there's this guy named Dan Jaffe. It's written here, and it's also written on your study guide. Dan Jaffe was studying air quality in the United States, and he found out that up here, where you would expect really good air quality, like redwoods and coastal breezes and stuff, right there, where you think like, oh, that should be really good. We actually have horrible air quality. And this was kind of a mystery. He was like looking at all these different parts of the United States and like, oh, well, the air quality there is affected by all the humidity. And like the air quality there is affected by like the Great Lakes. And like the air quality here is affected by like the jet stream or whatever. And then over here, he's like, well, that should be really good, right? And actually, there's this big current called the North Pacific Gyre. I guess that was on the ACT this last week.
Yes,
Yeah, I was.
SAT. And air pollution from coastal cities in China goes like this and hits California. Dan Jaffe discovered that there is this giant migration of air pollution from China to us. Number 14, he could measure how air pollution was tied to the rise of consumer culture in China. China basically has gone through all the consumer trends of the United States just really, really, really fast. I found out something the other day that I find so amazing. The Chinese word for China is middle nation,
Between heaven
and the Chinese word for the United States is beautiful nation. Which is kind of interesting, just saying as a parallel. Whatever crazy consumer trends are common in the United States, as China's average person has more wealth, they're like, well, I'd like to emulate what the Americans are doing. So like there's more Mercedes in China than in the United States now because people got rich and they're like, oh yeah, Mercedes, like that's what Americans are doing, right? And like consumer culture is exploding in China. Yeah.
Wait, so you're saying the air pollution in America or China is affected by the like rising of consumer culture?
Both. Dan Jaffe could measure it from here.
Okay, so we. Never mind. I got it.
No, it was like a thing, like a Mercedes that would cost like 70 grand. Here cost almost $300,000 there
No kidding.
because of taxes.
You sure that's real?
Yeah, they have like crazy import taxes.
I won't speak to this, but that goes against my understanding of their car market.
They
Um,
don't like cars.
I'm just saying I'm right. I'm just saying that's what I heard.
Number 15. Obviously, as the economy has exploded in China, their use of energy has exploded. And number 16, that's given Beijing some of the worst air quality on the planet. China holds the record for the number 1, number 2, and number 3 most air polluted cities ever. That's very new. 20 years ago, Chinese air quality was shockingly good. Because number 17, China gets almost all of its electricity from coal. They're making a transition already. They're like switching to solar and stuff. They're buying the most solar, they're making the most solar. But up until very recently, the majority of their electricity was made with coal. And this is an uncomfortable thing. They're not making coal with like cutting edge 2019 coal burning power plants. China's making electricity from coal burning power plants that went out of style in the 1940s here. They're using really crusty, dirty, old school coal burning power plants because they're just simpler and faster to build. When China's economy was expanding, they were just like, we need electricity, we need electricity. And so they would like build these cookie cutter coal burning power plants that are really crude and old school. People would be like, what about the air filters? What about the catalytic controls? And they're like, just faster, go, go. And they just skipped all that stuff. It's kind of like what the United States did 70, 80 years ago. They're just doing it bigger and faster. And number 18, China's reached an interesting moment. There's this guy named Kuznets. Like that. Kuznets.
enjoying some light reading.
Yeah. There's David Imperioli playing guitar. This guy named Kuznets won some big international award. I don't remember if it was like an economics, Nobel, something. But he studied the history of economies and he showed this really common pattern where your economy grows, you tend to harm the environment more until you reach a point of wealth where you're like, wait a minute, we don't need to burn all these trees. And you're like, I want clean air and I want clean water and I want to. So this is like a pattern that countries go through their economic development. They tend to, historically everywhere, do more and more and more environmental harm until it starts to taper off and then they start to protect the environment more. For the United States, that was Richard Nixon. Which is completely ironic because in his personal communications, he used a lot of really colorful, bad words to describe environmentalists. He used very derogatory language.
Like,
You can't say
I'm being videotaped. Specifically, I wouldn't use these words anyway. Yeah, I'm not going to get into it. But he was personally not much of an environmentalist, but our economy was at a point where, look, the timing is perfect. Back to the youth bulge. All the hippies were like, we're pissed about environmental stuff, and they were pissed about everything. They were pissed about civil rights, they were pissed about the war, they were pissed about our investment, our participation in foreign elections. And so he's like, all right, well, we'll just give them something. And we had like all of our environmental legislation right there. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the thing about reclamation of mines, the stuff about sanitary landfills. It all happened right there at once. And so China's getting to that point now where China's like, you know, our economy's grown, we're doing really well, let's start focusing on the environment. So China's going on this tipping point now, where back to 2019, they're like, we're going to be the world's biggest investor in solar power, we're going to be carbon free by the year 2040 or whatever.
that's good.
Number 19, China's biggest problem is the cars for air pollution. Because also at number 19, they're using really old emission standards called the Euro 2.
we're using really low what standards?
Emission standards.
Oh, that's right.
Like, Europe's moved on. I believe that Europe is on the Euro 5 standards now, or the Euro 6 standards. But China's like, all right, we'll go with Euro 2, which is like, you know, more than 20 years outdated. Yeah, Euro's on the 6D standards.
As in 6 with the letter D or 60?
Yeah, correct. Meaning that China is still producing cars that are kind of dirty because it's just simpler and faster to get them on the street. It's easier to sell. Number 20, China's economy is directly proportional to their carbon emissions. So as the economy grows, their carbon output goes up, meaning that they're still a carbon-based economy. Number 21, oh yeah.
Their economy is correlated to, like, they're using carbon or producing?
Both, because they use the carbon as a source of carbon bonds that they break to release the energy, and so that makes a lot of carbon emissions. Number 21, China's family size has stayed low. China's struggling to grow their economy by growing their population, but parents in China were often raised in a small household, so they tend to have small families, and it's really expensive to educate a child in China. And a lot of parents would rather have one really well-educated kid than two that are too difficult, too expensive to educate. But China has like a really serious investment in public education among the people, but it's very expensive, so they tend to have small families because of the cost of education. Number 22. China used to be the largest food grower in Asia for export, but now that so many Chinese people don't work in agriculture, ever since Chairman Mao, there's been this shift to factories and now to cities, that the Chinese have become the largest importer of food. So China cut agriculture to work on other stuff, and now they buy everybody else's food. And this is an interesting shift if you had a reason to care about Asian politics. China's gone from an exporter of food that everybody likes to a buyer of food that everybody's kind of bitter about. Number 23. China had a horrific flood in 1998 on its biggest river.
Which one?
Yeah, it says. Right,
The Yangtze River, it's right there.
You can read it.
This comes up later in our class, so it's one of those questions that I want to reflect in a couple of units. But the reason this matters is because China is still building big dams, which most of the developed world is totally over. Like in the United States, we stopped building dams in the 70s. But in China, when there was this huge flood in the middle of their economic explosion, when all their cities were expanding and cutting closer to the rivers, and all of a sudden, the biggest river floods the second biggest city. And like, it was horrible, like dead people flowing out to the sea, and it was like a huge disaster before you were born. But I remember this. When they had this humongous flood, China's like, dams, we're growing, we'll get our electricity from dams. This coal thing is getting really dirty, let's get onto the dam thing. And so China's doing what America did in the 30s on dams. Yeah.
So they're using dams to like get their energy rather than coal. Like, I don't really get the significance.
So
of
they
dams.
started in 1998 to plan what is now the world's largest dam. And they've also built a bunch of moderate-sized dams. So like phase 2 of electricity supply is like, oh yeah, we'll build dams, which gives you the double whammy of controlling floods.
I feel like that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, like, environmental policy-wise, we've learned in the US that dam building is not the best way to solve those two problems. But finally, number 24, there's this extremely famous photographer that I wanted you to know, because maybe you've caught on that I have an interest in photography. But this movie shows the work of a guy named Xi Xinong. And that guy is the most famous photographer in China. He's like the Ansel Adams of China, but he focuses on endangered species. So he gets all the credit for getting the Chinese people to do this. He took all these photographs of these really ugly monkeys that look like they have like a scrotum on their face. They're like the ugliest monkey you'll ever see. What?
Like the hot tub ones?
I don't know if they're the same, but they're kind of like that. Yeah, yeah. They're like kind of like skinny and tall and like
They have the gross
they have like stooped shoulders and like little beady eyes and they have this like weird nose. Anyway, this guy started taking all these pictures and all these people in China were like, oh, national pride, those are our species, they're going extinct because of our economy. We could probably afford to protect them. And so, like, the Chinese public went through this transition like Americans did with like bald eagles and blue whales and panda bears. And finally, number 25. The movie did not like answer this question, but at number 25, the movie makes this like rhetorical question: what should we do when a country's trying to develop? Because China's a perfect example. We don't want people to live in poverty, but when they develop, they're going to burn a bunch of trees on the way to getting a modern economy. So if we've just noticed that China does the cookie cutter coal-burning power plants, and then they do the dams and the air pollution stuff with the crappy cars, how do we deal with this? Do we keep them from developing an economy? That's not cool. Nobody wants to be living here. But do we just accept that for a country to modernize, they're going to have to burn a bunch of trees and coal and ruin rivers? And so, like, this is a trade-off at the heart of the China question. The reason that some cars are more heavily taxed in China is the size of their engines, and luxury cars have really big engines. But taxation of cars in China is proportional to the size of their engines. Little efficient engines are taxed far lower. Really big engines are taxed really high.
Oh, 7 liter.
What's that?
7 liter V12.
Yeah, right. That would probably be one of those extremely inflated prices. You're right.
Mercy logo.
Okay. I wanted to make sure before I put my foot in my mouth, but I just checked while I was lecturing. Yeah.
I have a question about number 9.
Go.
I just didn't know. Why are economic transitions so
Remember the failed
important?
transition thing? This line?
Oh, okay.
Where you got to keep the death rates from coming back up. You can't outpace your economy. So that thing about Singapore is the perfect example. If you can get that youth bulge into education, into the business world, into growing your economy, everybody wins. You raise all ships. Yeah. Children, put away all your stuff. We have to transition to the Unit 4 exams.
Aye.
I can do it. Attendance.
Why are you looking so monochromatic?
What?
Why are you looking so monochromatic?
Jose, are these in Neo?
No,
No.
we can turn off the...
Gotcha.
I think you just dump it in unit 4.
I made you a